The create worker function that we have is interesting because it creates in JavaScript what is known as a scope. And the local variables that we've created inside of that function, variables like work count, task1, task2, they are only visible inside of the function itself. So yes, you can have function definitions nested inside of other functions in JavaScript. That's how task1 can point to a function that is defined inside of another function that we assign to create worker. And that's something that we'll do a lot of in this course. And it's also great because task1 is a variable that is not visible outside of create worker. If I tried to go up to the worker object and invoke task1, that is going to be an error that tells me undefined is not a function. On line 28, that's essentially a way of saying, I don't know what task1 is, I got undefined for that, and then you tried to invoke it. That's just not going to work. So I need to remove that line. The only way I can get to task1 is because create worker explicitly referenced that in an object that it returns to the outside world. But task1 itself, it's inside the scope of create worker, it's not visible to the outside. And these variables that I have outside of this function definition, including the variable create worker and the variable worker, these are also in a scope, and unfortunately it is the global scope. They are global variables because they are defined outside of any other code, outside of any other function. If you've been doing software development for any time, you've probably heard that global variables are bad. They easily become a source of confusion and bugs. But in JavaScript, global variables are beyond bad. They're downright evil. Because JavaScript is a dynamically typed language, it's very easy for me to overwrite a global variable defined by someone else and vice versa. And so we try to avoid globals at all costs. And so my next question to answer will be this. Is there a way for me to define all the code that I have and execute that code and achieve the same output where I see task1 and task2 executing, and to be able to do that without creating any global variables? Well, I can think of one easy way to create only one single global variable. What if outside of create worker, I defined a function called program, and program is going to wrap up not just create worker, the function definition, but also the code where I instantiate a worker and call job1 and job2. Now currently the formatting is a little bit messed up, but if I go into the toolbar here of Plunker and I select beautify my code, that will go through the code and make sure that I have the proper indenting everywhere. And now let me temporarily close the developer tools so we can try to get this all on the screen. Now what I have is currently no global variables because create worker and worker, they're both now just variables defined inside of this program function. The only global variable I have is program itself. And now if I invoke program, I'll be executing this function, which will create a worker and have that worker perform some jobs. So if I open up the developer tools again, and let's clear the console and run the program, I get the same output I had before, which is the worker spits out task1, task2, 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 with a count of all the work being performed. So I'm down to one global variable. But how could I get to 0 global variables? Well, what if, instead of declaring a variable here called program, which will be global, what if I just took this function, and at the very bottom of that function definition, I just had it invoke itself? Well, there's one little problem here in that JavaScript doesn't particularly like this syntax. It doesn't like to have an anonymous function just sitting here that invokes itself. And what I have to do is apply an extra left parenthesis before the opening keyword function, and then have a corresponding close parenthesis at the end here before the semicolon. And now what I've built is something known in the JavaScript circles as an immediately invoked function expression. It is a function that I have defined that has some functions and some code inside of it that just immediately invokes itself. The end result being that if I clear the console and load this page, I now have all the same code executing that I had before, but because all of that code is wrapped up inside of a function, I'm not creating any global variables. All the variables that are being defined are local variables inside of that IIFE, that immediately invoked function expression. And yes, we'll use the occasional IIFE in this course to avoid creating any global variables. So we will see this pattern at work. And yes, you'll see it in a lot of other JavaScript code. A lot of libraries use IIFEs to control the scope of the variables, to build modules, to provide encapsulation, and most of all, to avoid those global variables.